So good to see you. My name's Julie Mavis. I'm the Director of Education here at the James Museum. So grateful that you all braved the weather to be with us tonight. I think that this is going to be a wonderful, what we meant to be a community conversation. So we're so happy to see a good crowd tonight. Thank you. Tonight's program is the last in a 3-part series that we put together in partnership with the Boxer Diversity Initiative. Which, if you're not familiar with it, it's a Sarasota-based nonprofit that funds initiatives designed to foster tolerance and understanding of all groups, no matter their race, religion, or gender identity. The James Museum is proud to work side by side with them to put on this series. So, thank you. The series grew out of the themes presented in our current special exhibition, which is on display up on the 2nd floor. From far east to west, the Chinese-American frontier. Tonight's program focuses more broadly on the Asian American experience today, and we envision this, as I said, as an important community conversation. So we're so glad again that you're here to participate, and I invite you to come back to see the exhibition if you haven't, and even if you have, to see it again and again. I think tonight's program will enrich your understanding and shed more light on the Chinese American experience and the Asian American experience. The exhibition closes on January 28th, so you do have time to see it. So it's my pleasure now to welcome to the podium Dan Boxer, who is the founder and head of the Boxer Diversity Initiative. Please welcome him.
Good evening, and I'm just echoing, I'm sure Julie thanked everybody for coming out tonight in such dire circumstances. And we really appreciate it. And we also want to thank the James Museum for partnering with us. They have been an absolute pleasure to work with. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Attorney Jin Liu, who will be moderating the program and the discussion. Ms. Liu is a shareholder in the Carlton Fields Law Group, and she acts as an attorney for international clients, and in particular Chinese clients. She formerly chaired the International Investment in Real Estate Committee of the American Bar Association Real Property Trust and Estate Law section. And she was recently named a Businesswoman of the Year by the Tampa Bay Business Journal. She's presently board chair of the Tampa Bay Downtown Partnership, and she's also a co-founder and board member of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Tampa Bay. She attended universities in the United States and in China. So please welcome Jin Liu.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Well, I think despite the weather, tonight is a beautiful evening because we have this opportunity to gather, to enlighten our minds, and to have conversations and dialogues of important topics today. So my role as your moderator, I wanted to start by introducing to you the sequence of our program for tonight. Immediately, I will be introducing our distinguished speaker, Professor Shin, as well as our local expert, Professor Wenxian Zhang. After that, Ian will come on stage to give a presentation, about 10 minutes. After that, Professor Zhang will also provide a local perspective about our particular Florida expert or experience regarding Asian Americans. After that, Ian and I will have a moderated discussion session, and then we will have audience Q&A. So that's the sequence for tonight. With that said, let me first of all introduce to you Professor Shin. Ian is Assistant Professor of History and American Culture. Allow me to get closer. At the University of Michigan. So go blue, and we all watched TV last night, right? Know what happened. Yes. Where he's also a core faculty member in the program in Asian Pacific Islander American Studies. Yan is a social and cultural historian of the United States, and his teaching and research focus on the history of U.S. foreign relations and Asian American studies. He's currently completing his first book, titled Imperial Stewards, Chinese Art and the Cultural Origins of America's Pacific Century, which looks at the politics behind Chinese art collecting in the United States in the early 20th century. His academic articles and reviews have appeared in America Journal, the Journal of American East Asian Relations, the Journal of Asian American Studies, the Public Historian, and the Connecticut Historic Review. In addition, he has contributed commentary on Asian American issues to the BBC World Service, PBS NewsHour, Los Angeles Times, the History Channel, and many other media outlets. Yan received his PhD degree from Columbia University. Now, with respect to our local expert, Professor Wenxian Zhang, he has been a member of Rollins College faculty since 1995. He is a recipient of the Cornell Distinguished Faculty Service Award and the Arthur Vining Davis Fellowship at Rollins, the Dorothy Dodd Outstanding Archivist Award for the Florida Historical Society, and the Award for Excellence from the Society of Florida Archivists. A productive professor and scholar, Professor Zhang published China Through American Eyes, Early Depictions of the Chinese American People and a Culture in the U.S. Print Media in 2018, which publication received the Jin Liu Award for the Best Research from the Chinese American Librarians Association in 2019. So without further ado, let me turn over to Professor Yuan Shin to give us a presentation. Thank you.
Can you all hear me okay? Great. I am astounded by the turnout tonight. I am used to snow, but I am not used to the kind of weather I saw, at least in the winter, this afternoon. So I really appreciate you all taking time out of your schedules to share this evening with us and to brave the elements for that. Before I start off with my remarks, I would be remiss if I didn't thank a few people. I want to start by thanking Dan and Lytton Boxer for the invitation to come to the Janes tonight and to share some thoughts with you. I want to thank Jin for that really generous introduction, Julie and the staff at the Janes for all of their work in coordinating this wonderful program and for making me feel, even in my first trip to St. Pete and to the Tampa Bay area, so at home. And then I know that there's a number of sponsors who've made this program possible, and I thank them as well. I want to sort of just give you quickly an overview of what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so, and then I'll get right into it. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Asian American history and the Asian American community, both historically and today. It's going to be at a fairly high level, and again, Professor Zhang is going to really get into the local details of what things look like here in Florida. Second, I'm going to talk about some of the recent successes that the Asian American community has faced, again, at a sort of more broad and national level, and then some of the challenges that the community's also faced. And then I'm going to end with some concluding thoughts as well as some suggestions for what you might do if you wanted to take action on some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. So let's start with some Asian American history. I understand some of you were here for Professor Chen's talk a couple months ago on Chinese exclusion. Maybe a show of hands to see. That's excellent. What a wonderful kind of repeat attendance, both for Professor Chen's and for the Janes Museum. I'm going to reference a few of the things that he shared with you that evening, but also hopefully add on some additional nuance and details in terms of just introducing, for especially those of you who didn't come to that talk, some of the basics of what the Asian American community looks like, how it came to live in the United States, and what it looks like today. So. This is a slide that I'll use to talk really quickly about sort of the broad strokes of Asian American life in the United States and Asian immigration to the United States. And you can see that it's divided into the top half and the bottom half. And the reason for that, and I'll just say it real quick, is because Asian Americans in the United States have never been divorced from the role of the United States across the world, specifically in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Much of the reason why Asians ended up in the United States is because the United States was over in Asia and the Pacific. Right? So this is one of these sayings that a Sri Lankan activist in the United Kingdom once said, which is, we're here because you were there. Right? These things are closely linked and we have to understand them together, right? So one of the first big waves of Asian immigration to the United States, of course, as many of you know from going upstairs to the exhibit, is that Chinese workers came to the United States in the 1840s and 1850s as a result of the gold rush. That was really the first big moment of Asian immigration to the United States, and thousands of them came first initially to work in the gold fields, eventually to work in agriculture, building the transcontinental railroad and other industries. They were initially very well received, actually, and many of that reception was driven by interest by business leaders in having cheap labor and finding that the Chinese were hard and happy workers, for example, in the construction of the transcontinental railroad. But over time, by the 70s and 80s especially, they began to see the Chinese as more of a threat. And especially white working class were resentful of the Chinese for what they thought were theft of their jobs in some of these key industries. This might be some of the rhetoric that you're familiar with if you're following politics around immigration in the country today. And they constructed an image of the Chinese as inassimilable. That is, they could not become American. They were too different in terms of how they lived, what they looked like, the food that they ate, the clothes that they wore, their living conditions, and constructed them as people that needed to be kept out of this country. And as a result, again, for those of you who were here for Professor Chen's lecture, you might remember that in 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first piece of legislation ever to target a specific racial group for exclusion from the United States. Chinese were not allowed, Chinese workers in particular were not allowed to enter the United States. They were also not allowed to naturalize as citizens. And that was something that was on the books all the way until 1943. Across that time span, if you're following the timeline on the top half of the graph, you'll notice that by 1924, that prohibition had extended not just to the Chinese, but to other Asian groups that came along. As the wave of Chinese workers died out because of exclusion, other Asian workers slowly came to fill the void. So there were lots of Japanese workers that came, some Koreans, small number of South Asian or Indian workers who came as well in the early 1900s. Subsequent legal actions and policies slowly also kept them out of the country and unable to naturalize. By 1924, an Immigration Act prohibits all immigration from Asia, regardless of where they come from, which Asian countries they come from. What changes is World War II. And you might recall your World War II history that in World War II, the United States is fighting with Japan, against Japan, I should say, but on the side of China. And so the kind of geopolitics of the moment means that it's very hard for you to make a case that you're the leader of the free world and also that you're a good ally to the Chinese people if you keep them out of your country. And so as a result of fighting World War II and the activism of people around the globe, the United States actually repeals Chinese exclusion in 1943. That whole system finally falls apart in 1965. That's the most kind of recent turn in US immigration law. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 says, we don't care where you come from anymore, we care who you are related to and what you can do for this country in terms of your education and work credentials. So that's still the kind of law of the land in terms of immigration, but that means that for the last 70 years or so, what has, the kinds of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants that have come to this country have generally been ones that are highly educated, who are highly professional workers, knowledge workers, et cetera, many of whom probably you've seen in your daily life and met in your daily life. So that's sort of at a very high level, 30,000 foot level, the experience of Asians in the United States. And I'll go into a little bit more detail further on. I also want to call your attention to the bottom half of the screen. Again, what I said earlier, that these things are interconnected. You cannot understand the experience of Asians in the United States without understanding the role of the United States in the world, right? So those of you who maybe have had interactions with Filipino healthcare workers in your life will understand that one of the things that led there to be a large number of Filipino doctors and nurses in this country is because the United States colonized the Philippines between 1898 and the 1940s. The United States had colonies in Asia, and the Philippines was one of them. And they created medical colleges and nurse training centers that continue to have an impact today. And that's why there's such a strong pipeline of Filipino healthcare workers here in the United States. The United States also, as part of that time period, annexed and then later made into a state, Hawaii, which had a large Asian population as a result of labor on the plantations in that part of the Pacific. And then most recently, and I think Professor John will talk a little bit about this as well, in the 70s and 80s, the United States fought wars in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And those wars generated millions of refugees, many of whom came to the United States. They went elsewhere as well, but millions of them came here to the United States. So one of the things that's interesting is that you see in the last 70 years that there's been kind of a split, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of disparity within the Asian American community. You have kind of well-educated, highly professional, highly mobile Asian workers from especially countries like China, Taiwan, Korea, and India. But you also have people who have been essentially displaced from their countries, especially from Southeast Asia. Right? So you have this community that's really a community of contrast, of highly professionalized, highly educated people, and also folks who have left their country involuntarily because of the ravages of war, right? War that was caused by the United States. I want to just emphasize a couple more themes related to this history, which is to start first that Asian Americans have endured a long history of violence and exclusion. As part of being kept out of this country, this first picture here shows the process of interrogation that happened. As a result of trying to control this immigration, the United States set up something called Angel Island Immigrant Station in San Francisco Bay. This is where Asian immigrants, as they arrived, would be processed. Many of them were kept, sometimes for days, sometimes for months, sometimes even for years. They were asked highly invasive personal questions about their personal backgrounds and family backgrounds. They would be asked by the immigration inspectors, how many chickens does your family own? How many steps is it between your house and your uncle's house? And if your answers didn't match up with the answers that your father gave, you couldn't prove that you were actually related to a US citizen, you couldn't come into the country, and you were deported back to China, right? So this is the kind of immigration control that especially Chinese immigrants, but other Asian immigrants face as well. Of course, there was, during World War II, the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. The majorities, 120,000, were citizens of the United States. And even though there was much talk at that time about national security, we now know that during World War II, there was actually not a single instance of Japanese Americans who committed espionage on behalf of the Japanese Empire. And that was entirely a kind of wartime hysteria. We now know that, and the courts even have admitted to it in retracting some of the legal opinions that upheld the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, right? But that was another low point in American history. And then more recently, we've also seen a history of violence and exclusion that's not committed by the government. Everyday people have also committed acts of violence against Asian immigrants. In the 1980s, I mentioned that Vietnamese refugees were coming to the United States in large numbers. And actually, there was a case that the Southern Poverty Law Center helped to fight with the Vietnamese American community against the KKK, who used intimidation tactics to try to scare the Vietnamese fishermen out of the fishing industry because they were afraid, this was around the Gulf Coast in Texas, that they were, again, encroaching on white Americans' jobs in the fishing industry. So this is both a history of state-sponsored and state-endorsed violence and exclusion, but it's also a history of informal, everyday people who also participated in these acts. But the other side of that story that's really important to remember is that Asian Americans have never taken this sitting down. In various forms, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Koreans have all resisted the violence and exclusion that they face. Some of that has been through legal challenges and electoral politics. So the man you see on the left side of the screen is a man whose face you'll see upstairs, and his name is Wong Kim Ark. He was born in the United States and left for China. When he returned in the 1880s, he was told that he could not enter because he was not somebody who, because Chinese were not allowed to enter the United States. And he pointed to the 14th Amendment and said, the 14th Amendment says that everyone who is born, any persons born in the United States is a US citizen, a US citizen. And the Supreme Court, not because they like Asian people, they actually didn't, but because the text of the document said so, they had to say, That's right. There's something called birthright citizenship in this country, and we will give it to anyone who is born in the United States. So in fact, the principle of birthright citizenship was established by a Chinese immigrant, or I should say someone who's born, a Chinese American who's born in the United States. And that is a right that all immigrants and all Americans enjoy as a result. We also have examples of Asians who have partnered with other communities in order to fight back against injustice. The picture that I put in the middle, this man on the right is a man named Larry Itliong. He was a Filipino labor leader. You might recognize the man on the left. That's Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was really the face of the agricultural workers, farm workers movement in the 1960s. Those of you who remember the grape strike in California in the 1960s will remember Cesar Chavez. He was the face of the movement. But Larry Itliong, this Filipino labor organizer, was just as much of a partner. And he realized that because Filipinos were also working a lot in the same grape fields and other agricultural areas, they could not win better working conditions for these workers without partnering with Mexican workers. Because as you might imagine, if the Filipino workers were to strike, the white farm owners would just say, well, we'll hire Mexican workers to come, right? And so what they did was to band together and say, as both Filipino and Mexican workers, we as farm workers together will strike. And that is what forced farm owners to come to the table, right? So we have these instances in which Asian Americans have worked in conjunction with other minorities to fight for equal rights in this country. And then finally, I also want to just note very quickly that Asian American women have been part of this struggle as well. The woman you see here is Patsy Mink, who ran for and was the first Asian American woman elected to US Congress. Her major legislative achievement is Title IX. She was the woman who really pushed that through. And as the initiator of that, we now have programs and systems and processes in place to make sure that there's equal rights and participation, regardless of gender, in places like colleges and universities, right? We know how fragile those rights are and how fragile those resources are, but these are fruits of the activism of Asian Americans. As they faced exclusion and racism and violence over the last 150 years, 170 years, they have always pushed back. So what does this look like today? Where are we with the Asian American community? I've given you Asian American history at like a 30,000 foot level. I usually teach a 15-week course on this at the University of Michigan. So you may have some questions. I'm very happy to answer them during the Q&A. But I do want to just give you a quick snapshot of where Asian Americans are, right? You've heard about the incredible diversity of the community that I've talked about in terms of the waves of immigration that came. That is something that's really key to remember. This is an incredibly diverse community. If you just think about the continent of Asia, right? The number of countries, religions, language groups that exist in that continent, there's really no reason that all of them would be grouped together as a demographic group. But we have done that, or people started doing that in the 1960s. That's when the term Asian American was born, because they realized that regardless of whether or not you were Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Filipino, there are too small numbers here in the United States. And banding together was going to create a larger movement for change. So that diversity is still the case in the United States as of 2020. There are about 24 million Asian Americans or people of Asian descent living in the United States. That's about 7% of the population, a little north of that. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make an additional 0.2% of the population. I'm not going to really talk very much about Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders today. Their histories, their experiences really deserve time and space of their own. You often will hear people talk about AAPIs, right, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and I may use that quickly and interchangeably with Asian Americans, but today I'm really talking about Asian Americans. But as I said, Asian Americans trace their ancestries to a large number of countries, lots of different languages. You might be more familiar in your day-to-day life, in your social networks and circles, with people from China, India, or the Philippines, Korea, or Japan. But actually, the fastest growing Asian American ethnic groups in the United States are people from Bhutan, Nepal, and Burma, right? So these smaller groups that less folks know. In addition to kind of where people come from, the community is also really diverse in terms of their class, in terms of their religion. And one of the things I just want to show you is this chart from the Pew Research Center that shows that from 1970 to 2016, Asian Americans at the top 10% of the community's income, right, grew, the sort of divergence or disparity in terms of the top 10 versus the bottom 10% grew the most of any racial group in the United States. And this is just an illustration of the kind of economic disparity within the Asian American community. Let me give you just a couple more statistics to kind of illustrate what I mean by this. That within, for example, in terms of median household income, Indian Americans earn on average $100,000 a year, right? Burmese Americans, people from the country of Burma, earn only $36,000 a year, right? In terms of Asians with at least a bachelor's degree among adults who are 25 years old or older, 72% among Indians, 9% among people from the country of Bhutan, right? So when you're thinking about sort of the stereotypical image of who Asian Americans are, you might have this image that we call a model minority image of Asian Americans as highly educated, highly upwardly mobile, very professional, right? But that actually kind of obscures a lot of diversity within the community. It means that people don't get the help that they need because there's an assumption that everyone is doing fine. So when we're talking about Asian American issues, and as I'm going into the rest of my remarks and talking about some of the successes and challenges of the community, right, keep that diversity in mind. Keep that diversity in mind of who are we talking about and who are we not talking about, right? All right, so I'm going to talk now about some successes that the community has faced in the last few years, right? In a discussion like this, in an event like this, it's often very easy for me as a historian of immigration to talk about some of the problems, many of the problems, of which there have been many, right? Exclusion, incarceration, refugees, right? But there are also things that have changed, arguably for the better, in the last 5 years, and we want to pay attention to those. The first, and this is, debatable depending on, where you stand, Asian American representation in politics and the law has improved. Asian Americans are at the forefront of political discussions, both nationally and here in Florida, right? We have our first vice president of Asian descent, Kamala Harris, who is the daughter of an Indian mother and a black father. At least, two of the Republican presidential candidates currently are of Indian descent. Right, and here in Florida, we had, former Representative Stephanie Murphy, who represented Orlando, and in Boynton Beach, the first Asian American mayor in Florida, Ty Pensterga. So there is, not only here in Florida, but also nationally, lots of Asian American leaders who are stepping up running for offices. This is important because you remember a lot of what ends up happening is decisions get made when people are not in the room, when they're not at the table. And so part of what has been wonderful about having some of these faces is that there is a seat at the table now for Asian Americans. In the legal sector, it's interesting to note that this sort of second line that says Court of Appeals, this is information from the Asian American Bar Association, that the current number of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander judges on the US Courts of Appeal, this is the level of US federal courts just below the Supreme Court, is actually disproportionately higher in the United States population of Asian Americans, right? So we are kind of catching up to, again, in these very crucial spheres of politics and the law, representation for Asian Americans. But remember, it's only useful so far to look at and look for faces of a particular background, right? And one of the things I'm going to talk about in terms of successes is that you also have to pay attention to what is actually the substance of the change that's being implemented, right? People can look a certain way, but what are the kinds of policies they're actually fighting for? Asian American representation in business, again, another area where Asian Americans can be very proud of the successes that they have earned and achieved. On the left, you see the portraits of 4 Asian American CEOs. You've probably seen them in the news. Lisa Su at AMD Micro Devices, Sundar Pichai, who is the CEO of Alphabet and Google. You also see Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, and Jensen Huang, who is the CEO of NVIDIA. Some of you who are familiar with the stock markets will know S&P 500 growth has been driven by what are called the Magnificent Seven, these kind of really big tech stocks that are really helping to drive the economy right now. 3 of those 7 are led by Asian American CEOs, right? So some might say, you guys are great, you're doing so well, right? But, caveat, again, right? One of the things that we know is that actually Asian American CEOs are disproportionately lower than where they are as a proportion of the population. So here's some research from Goldman Sachs that shows that Asian Americans' share of S&P 500 CEO positions is stalling around 2%. It went up to roughly about almost 2.5% in the 20-teens, but has fallen back down again. Right? So in terms of achievements for Asian Americans in the corporate sector, there's a saying or there's a phrase called the bamboo ceiling, which is kind of an Asian American take on the glass ceiling. That term, not everybody comes from a country with bamboo, so you don't really you can take it with a grain of salt. But what it means is that Asian Americans, because of the way they're perceived, often hit kind of a ceiling in terms of their promotions. They're seen as very hardworking, very self-sacrificing, good team players in terms of working hard until very late. And then at the middle management or upper management positions, they're seen as not creative enough, not social enough, not friendly enough, not creative enough. And they start to drop off. And this is one of the reflections that you see is even though there are in many sort of tech and finance industries, even in law, large numbers of Asian Americans in junior positions, it drops off significantly near the middle and top. The other interesting to know is that in terms of Asian American CEOs, there's been research that shows that Asian American CEOs are more likely to be brought in when companies are recovering or struggling. And isn't that interesting? Because it says something about the way, again, that Asian American leaders are perceived as you're going to be a good team player, you're going to really put your head down and really be self-sacrificing and lift this organization up. But you're not seen as the leaders who are visionaries, growth-oriented, creative, and innovative, right? So even in the case where Asian American CEOs are brought in, there's research that shows that the circumstances means that there are certain expectations around them that are, in fact, quite negative. Finally, or well, not finally, but one of the maybe slides that's more fun to talk about is Asian American representation in entertainment. Right? Those of you who watched the Golden Globes just a couple nights ago saw that Ali Wong and Steve Yeun won Best Actors and Actress for Beef. I don't know how many of you saw that show. I couldn't take it. It was a little too intense for me. But I loved Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? I love Shang-Chi. Many of you maybe saw Crazy Rich Asians. There's an explosion almost of Asian American media at the moment in film and television. Social media, TikTok has been another place where Asian American creators have really gotten a foothold, right? Again, though, think about what's happening behind the scenes, right? And here, one of the things that's been really encouraging is to see that these stories are no longer just kind of reinforcing and reproducing kind of tired tropes of Asian men as martial artists. Well, I don't know about Shang-Chi, but and Asian women as sort of geisha girls, right? These are, for once and finally, Asian American characters that have fully fleshed out stories. They experience joy and sadness and success and struggle. And that's what we really want to see, right, is kind of fully human characters who are Asian American. Because popular culture is one of the main ways that many non-Asian Americans come into contact with Asian people, it is particularly important that you have both diverse representation in Hollywood, but also representation that is deep and nuanced and again, human. And then finally, I want to just end the success portion by talking about the growing interest in the Asian American experience. Here are some headlines from the last few years that track the growing interest in learning about Asian American history and Asian American identity in state K-12 education curriculum, including here in the state of Florida, which in last May passed a bill that would include Asian American history in the school's teaching curriculum, right? I'm going to come at you with another but, right? But what else is happening in Florida, right? I don't have to tell you, you all know what is not being taught. There is a suppression of certain kinds of African American history, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in colleges and universities, right? And that disparity means we have to ask, why are you interested in teaching one group's history, but not another? What kind of history are you then teaching, especially when you think about what I just talked about in terms of partnerships between Asian people and other racial minorities in our history? How do you keep that history out of teaching Asian American history, right? So you have to ask these questions at a moment when we're being included, what does that actually mean? What kind of inclusion are we actually earning, right? So I managed hopefully to talk about some successes and also sneaking in a couple of ways in which we can challenge how those successes really are defined, right? What kind of success is it? What kind of inclusion are we getting, right? And is it actually what we're looking for? Okay, now to the really depressing stuff. I want to talk a little bit about challenges, right? And these are serious topics. I'm trying to lighten up the mood a little bit, but for the next couple of minutes, I do want to talk about some of the serious challenges that the Asian American community is facing right now. Right? And I'm talking at the national level, and Professor Zhang and Jin and I will talk a little bit more about what's happening locally, right? I see a lot of Asian faces in the room. Thank you for coming. But I also know that there are a lot of folks who are not from the community. And one of the things that I want to sort of say tonight is thank you for your interest in a group of people that you maybe are not personally related to, right? And I want to share with you a little bit now for the next few minutes the things that weigh on this community's mind from the perspective of, again, national politics and other conversation. And I appreciate your empathy in advance. The first thing that we have to talk about is the uptick in anti-Asian discrimination and violence, right? There's a long history of this in this country that I've already talked about earlier in my remarks. This has happened to increase in the last 3 years, especially after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has taken lots of different forms, from verbal abuse to physical assault. In some of these cases, the stories have been really tragic. A father and his children being slashed in the face of a parking lot in Walmart in Texas. An 84-year-old man being shoved and dying as a result of being shoved in San Francisco. This is happening all over the country. Thousands of incidents in which people are reporting being harassed, being attacked, right? The graphs that I have shown here are from the Pew Research Center again, and they're about sort of slightly less overt instances of assault. But as you can see, at least between 74 to 80% of either US-born or foreign-born Asian Americans have experienced one of these ways of being treated as a foreigner, right? That you don't belong in this country, maybe people mispronouncing the name, people acting as if they don't speak English, being told directly. A third of Asian Americans have reported being told that they should go back to their own country. And a fifth, 1 in 5 roughly, Asian Americans have been criticized for speaking a language other than English in public. These are the kinds of experience that people are facing, right? And again, this sort of stereotype of Asian Americans as high achieving and smart can seem like a positive thing, but it is also a stereotyping in a way and making assumptions about a group of people. So at least 63% of Asian Americans who were interviewed for this study said that they have at least either been, people have assumed that they're good at math and science. I get that all the time. I'm terrible at math and science. And also people assuming that they're not a creative thinker. Again, the way that it ties into the promotion of Asian American leaders and executives. So this is one of the things that we are very mindful of in the Asian American community. There has been a rash of attacks, assaults, harassment, abuse on Asians in this country. Some of these things don't entirely have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. I've been noticing an increasing number of reports of home invasions and robberies in the Asian American community, because there is an understanding among perpetrators of these crimes that Asians are more likely to keep large amounts of cash at home. And so this is not a sort of bias-motivated, right, crime, but it still nevertheless exploits the community's characteristics. That also is a form of violence that makes people feel on edge, feel like they have a target on their back and feel unsafe, right? So that's something that I hope you can understand. A lot of this traces to a deeper issue, which is the current political discourse around the United States geopolitical competition with China, right? The biggest sort of factor in all of this has to be that since 2020, there has been at least one very strong voice, and others following him, of calling a global health pandemic something that was a China virus or the Kung flu. And that has instigated a lot of people to attack people of Asian descent, regardless of whether or not they were actually Chinese, right? So this, I referenced earlier an 84-year-old Thai man being pushed to his death in San Francisco. Not Chinese American, nothing to do with China, attacked nonetheless because that person believed that he was responsible or somehow tied to the coronavirus. One of the other things to be mindful of is that even outside of the COVID-19 pandemic, right, there was, until 2022, something called the China Initiative, in which the United States government disproportionately targeted Chinese scientists and said, because of your collaborations and funding from China, we think you may be committing espionage and giving national security secrets to the Chinese government. In many of those cases, those charges were proven either false or pled down to simply not keeping good tabs on documents. But they have destroyed lives and careers in the process of doing this, and actually hampered the innovation of the United States higher education sector because people are nervous to go into the areas that they feel most motivated to research because they fear that they will be targeted by the US government. This was done away by the Biden administration in 2022, but as you can see, even just earlier this year, the House Republicans have talked about restarting this DOJ China initiative that Chinese academics in particular were very fearful of because it meant that you might be targeted for your research activities. One of the other things that the United States, that Asians in the United States has been dealing with has been a conversation around affirmative action. Some of you who were paying attention to the news last summer saw that the Supreme Court ruled on a case called Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard that it was no longer possible, and it was unconstitutional, in fact, for colleges and universities to bring race into the consideration of admissions for colleges. This case, Students for Fair Admissions at Harvard, was brought by this organization, SFFA. It was, in fact, headed by a conservative activist named Ed Blum, who has been trying to dismantle affirmative action since the 1990s. He tried earlier with a case that highlighted the experiences of a young white college applicant, and that case was unsuccessful. And he turned to the Asian community as a way to work against affirmative action. In fact, studies show that almost 70% of Asian Americans, and this differs based on ethnicity, but 70% roughly of Asian American registered voters support affirmative action that make it possible for there to be programs and resources for minorities, including Asian Americans, to have a better shot at getting into college, because there have been disparities in how racial minorities are admitted into colleges and universities in the past. One of the things that we notice, again, is that Asian Americans are being used as a wedge issue to sort of say that to dismantle affirmative action, they should look at Asian Americans as a way to take away a program that benefited all racial minorities. And so that's one of the challenges of the community, that it is being used as a way to represent the interests of the community when in fact that charge is being led by somebody who's from outside of the community. The other challenge to the community around admissions is that it has not actually made things easier for Asian American applicants and their families. And so you see here from the LA Times a headline that says, after affirmative action was done away with, Asian Americans are still more stressed than ever about college admissions. And I fully realize as a college professor how stressful that process is. Perhaps some of you have children who are going through it right now. And the challenges around that, though, have to do with an opaque process in which success is defined very narrowly in terms of your ability to attend one of a very small handful of colleges, right? I didn't get into Harvard, I didn't get into Princeton, I didn't get into Yale. I think I'm doing fine, right? My parents may disagree, but I think I'm doing fine, right? But success is defined very narrowly sometimes within the Asian American community, right? And the other thing that is a challenge is also there is other people who are benefiting from college admissions, especially athletes and children of alumni, right? Who this program, this doing away with affirmative action, did nothing to undercut the privilege and the unfair advantage that they have in college admissions. And in fact, those folks benefit much more than racial minorities did under affirmative action. So these are some of the challenges that, again, are challenging to talk about because they're so personal, right? They affect the futures of our kids and our grandchildren, and we want them to do well. But it's important to sort of think about the bigger picture of what it means for a community to be used as a wedge against other things to try to achieve social justice and equity in this country. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of challenges is around mental health access and stigma. All of these things added together, college admissions in your future, US-China relations and their effects, anti-Asian violence and discrimination, mean that there is a serious mental health issue in the Asian American community. People feel anxious, people feel unsafe, and that has meant that according to data from the CDC in 2018, that for Asian American youth between the ages of 15 to 24, intentional self-harm, which is to say suicide, I'm sorry to say, is the leading cause of death. That's true for no other racial group in this age range, right? And one of the things that, as you can see here from a study that was, this is from California, but I think broadly applicable to Asians elsewhere as well, is that the percentage of Asian Americans who understand that they have mental and emotional issues, but who seek help and treatment is among the lowest of various racial groups in the United States. That's also, again, broken down based on ethnicity. South Asians are more likely to seek mental health access and treatment than, for example, Vietnamese and everybody else other than South Asians, right, are less than half likely to seek mental health treatment. A lot of that has to do with cultural factors of not wanting to air your grievances or difficulties beyond the family, of being kind of very mindful of how others may have a negative perception of you outside of the community. A lot of it also is structural. There's not a lot of mental health access for folks who are culturally competent or who have the language to deal with a patient in their native language. So these are serious issues that we see building off of some of the other causes and drivers that we see. And the challenges that the Asian American community faces, I hope I've convinced you, are quite grave and need a lot of support. So let me conclude. I don't want to go on for too long. We have more chances to engage in conversation together with each other and also with Jin. But I want to just kind of drive home 3 points as I close. The first is to keep in mind that the community is very diverse. And especially when you think about some of the differences I've shown you in terms of ethnicities, of the achievements and resources that, for example, South Asians and East Asians have compared to Southeast Asians, that's important to think about the needs of the entire community and to break those down and to be aware of how ethnicity, language, class, religion affect people's access and success. The second is kind of the point that I made earlier about how racism and xenophobia have been constant pressures on the community since the first Asians arrived in the United States. But it's also important to note that Asian Americans have never taken it sitting down and have always fought back through various means that are available to them. That's what gives me hope when I think about the challenges that the community faces. Many of the things, including some of the land bills that we'll talk about here in Florida and other parts of the United States, including some of the programs that target scientists and graduate students here in Florida and elsewhere, the community has faced these things before and has found a way around it, and we can do so again. And then finally, the point I want to drive home is that the Asian American community is not going to resolve these injustices on its own. It needs to work with others, partly because they're just not, 7% of the US population is Asian American. And so there are not enough people to really change the conversation on their own. But it's also a matter of history, that Asian Americans have historically reached out to other groups to fight against injustice, and that those attempts have been successful. I'm reminded of that famous saying that some of you may remember of a pastor during World War II, about how first they came for various different groups, and then they came for me, and there was nobody else left to stand for me. And that is my fear, is that we look too narrowly in the interests of our own community and forget that everyone rises and falls together. So what can we all do? I want to just put up some suggestions. I think about making change in both a short-term interpersonal level and a long-term structural level. Coming to an event like this, coming to other events at the James, is a great starting point. Learning about the community, supporting organizations like the Boxer Diversity Initiative and the James in sort of advancing conversations. Because there is still an uptick in violence against Asian Americans, there are programs out there that will train you how to be a bystander, to intervene if you see something happening. How do you de-escalate a situation, or how do you help somebody who may be the target or a victim of harassment? Those of you who are here who are Asian and Asian American, I hope that you will think about taking good care of yourselves. That's the first thing that I hope for. That it has been a difficult few years. I mean, hell, it's been a difficult 150 years, but it's been difficult particularly in the last few years. And it's important to think about seeking the help and support that you need for the issues that you face. Talking with others in the community about anti-Blackness, how do we relate to other communities? How do we partner with other communities? Have intentional conversations about that. I think it's important to talk with kids about racism so that it does not become something that they are exposed to without any kind of mediation, to understand that despite what others may think about them, that it is still good to be proud of their heritage and to represent that diversity in their schools, on their teams. And then jumping to sort of the longer term structural solutions, a lot of the short term stuff is stuff we do with one another, but it's also important to make sure that those solutions endure, that they will stick around. And the most important thing for that is policy change, to make sure that we elect people who are not only Asian Americans, but who stand for communities that have been marginalized, who stand against the sort of racism and xenophobia that I've talked about tonight, and to pursue policies that uplift the Asian American and other minority communities, including especially the implementation of Asian American K-12 education. So I hope that, again, I probably have gone over a little bit too long, but I hope that this gives you, at again, a 30,000-foot level, a good sense of the history of where Asian Americans in this country come from, some of the things that Asian Americans are really happy and excited about at the moment, and that some of you perhaps have enjoyed in terms of the successes, and also some of the deep challenges that the Asian American community faces. But more than anything, I hope that the last couple of slides give you a sense that we can do this. This is not something that needs to get us down, that has to, that is unsolvable, that this is something that the community has faced before, and that together we will face again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful, very insightful talk. I found this very difficult for me to follow, but I'll try. Thank you so much, Julia, Dan, the James Museum Box Initiative for the wonderful display. And thank my good friend, Dr. Shi, for the personal tour. I really enjoy. I also have a disclaimer. I will not describe myself as an expert. I did a little bit of study and I care a lot about Asian American in Florida. Let me see if I go to my slide. Okay. So as Ian mentioned, Asian American experience is very, very diverse. Asian Americans' experience in Florida are rich and diverse. They began to arrive in Florida during the Reconstruction era, concentrated mainly in railroad construction, agriculture, laundry, restaurant, and grocery business. Their population grew very slowly until after World War II, when the discrimination policy was finally lifted. 1965 Immigration Act, the opening of Walt Disney and other attractions, end of the Vietnam War, and thriving Sunbelt economy have all brought new immigrants to Florida, shifted by waves of immigration and socio-economic factors. Asian Americans are among the fast-growing group in the Sunshine State. Although their experience, their presence may not be as historically significant as in other states, there's still a fascinating tapestry of endeavors that reflect their struggles since the late 19th century, as well as the multiple contributions made by this dynamic community. Among all Asians, Chinese first came to Florida in the years right after the Civil War. At the time, the state struggled with the dire need for rebuilding the New South after the war shattered the Confederate economy and social relationship based on slavery. With the smallest population among all southern states, Florida had the vast areas of land and almost non-existent industrial base. The state economy was based chiefly on lumber, citrus, cotton plantation, phosphate mining, land drainage, railroad construction, all required a growing labor force. So prior to 1900, open calls for immigration was to welcome all types of nationalities among the Chinese, but not especially. As early as 1866, St. Augustine Examiner urged the state to consider the wholesale import of coolies as laborers for the Florida cotton field. 3 years later, a proposal was drafted at a Chinese Labor Convention in Memphis that urged the Southerner to cooperate with the efforts of importing the laborers of Southern Mongolia wreath from both California and Cuba at $100 per head, with a payment about $8 to $12 per month. So this is from when I published my book, China Through American Eyes. So this is one of the images. So that's give you the context. When the Chinese being chased out on the West Coast, southern plantation owners want the Chinese to come here to be the labor force. Though never a large workforce, quite a few Chinese did make their way to Florida, some by way of California or New York, or from Cuba, initially working on plantations in lumber and timber camps and the railroad construction. Chinese soon left the work gangs for better economic opportunity in Jacksonville, Tampa, Pensacola, and later Miami, and was able to carve out a successful niche in the state service sector. And in other part of the country, laundries account for most of the Chinese business, with restaurant and grocery trading behind. Since the laundry required little capital or machinery, only the commitment to working long and hard. So from late 1880s, every major cities in Florida had one or more Chinese laundries, according to Tampa Tribune. The city had 48 Chinese laundries in 1895, employed about 200 watchmates, most of them African Americans. And the gentleman on the right, Luo Jingguang, who was a Chinese pioneer who helped develop the Chinese citrus industry by fertilizing a new specimen of orange, which he named after himself. Won the first World Silver Medal from U.S. Pomological Society in 1911. Unfortunately, when I nominated him for the Florida Citrus Hall of Fame, I've been denied for the last 5 years because, according to the reviewers, his story oversold. I don't know how many of you know his story. So this is ongoing, still there. In addition to laundry, Chinese also run small truck farms in Jacksonville area growing winter vegetables for the Chinese market in the north. Nonetheless, most of the early Chinese business ventures were temporary and small-scale phenomena. Their development was hindered by the lack of a sizable ethnic clientele and from an economic system that pushed the Chinese into a restricted set of marginal occupation. By 1920s, Florida experienced a period of land boom, and that's the time when Joe Wing and Joe Fred Gong migrated to the state and launched the Chinese grocery business in Miami. Joe actually is their Chinese name. Joe, they Americanized because therefore Joe's very typical American first name. So they adopted their own new last name. So through family kinship, Joe began to open and sell grocery stores to newly arrived relatives. So before long, Joe's market began to pop up. And by 1967, there were 38 independent owned and operated market in and around Miami. Although the grocery was hard work with long hours and low profit margin, it offered a new immigrants an opportunity to make an honest living and sustain the growth of the Chinese community in South Florida. This grocery tradition is actually tailored to African American in Overtown area of Miami, because you may remember in the Jim Crow South, African American are not allowed to shop in white-owned store. So Joe opened the market tailored to African Americans. Unfortunately, during the ghetto riot in the 1960s, after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in the late 1960s, so all those stores vandalized, several of grocers shut. So by the 1970s, only 1 or 2 left open. So that's the last store according to Miami Herald. At the turn of the 20th century, Japanese was also recruited to Florida for land development opportunities. The best known example was the Yamato colony in South Florida. In 1903, Joe Sakai visited Florida, searched for land settlement. Warmly received, he signed an agreement with Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway to locate a colony of Japanese farmers in the Boca Raton areas. By 1907, the Florida East Coast Railway reached Yamato, and the U.S. Post Service also opened a branch there. However, the good fortune did not last long. In 1908, a pineapple blight destroyed the crop, and before the community could get back on its feet, competition from Cuba Farm dealt another deadly blow to the colony's agricultural business. Although Yamato survived for a few years afterwards, the dream of a booming agricultural community was over. Disillusioned, many colonists returned to Japan. During the next couple of decades, a few farmers lived quietly at Yamato. However, when the United States entered the war with Japan in 1941, they became subject to suspicion. Finally, the War Department confiscated the remaining Japanese holdings in the area and used part of the land for the U.S. Army Air Force complex. So the last remaining survivor, who remained, he went to grade school to learn English. He began to purchase the land. Eventually, he became a United States citizen in the 1960s. And before his death, he donated his land, his cash, that become the Japanese garden at the Delray Beach area. Beautiful. Yeah, that's the lasting legacy. World War II not only set the United States on a new path to the Asian Pacific region, but also had a profound impact on Asians already in the US and the future of Asian immigration. Echoing the national trend, Asian population in Florida began to rise after the war. The new wave of Asian immigrants come primarily from several different sources. First, servicemen married women from Philippines, China, Japan, Korea, and brought them back to the States. America's continuous involvement in Asia also brought streams of refugees and military employees to Florida. In addition, the repeal of a previous discrimination legislation further boosted the Asian immigration. Notable among the new immigration group are Filipinos, Asian Indians, and the Vietnamese. Ever since the Spanish-American War, Filipinos had begun to work in the U.S. Navy, mostly as supporting personnel. For several decades since 1960, Filipinos were the largest single Asian group in the Sunshine State. After 1965 immigration reform that promoted admission of professionals with with skills, thousands of Filipino physicians and even a large number of Filipino nurses, they came to the United States, and many made their way to Florida. By 1990, some 32,000 Filipinos called Florida home. Well, the largest concentration was in DeWalt County, home of the naval base in Jacksonville. A substantial number of Filipinos also live in the Tri-County, Pensacola area. In the 1970s, Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians became the fast-growing sector among Asian Americans in Florida. The fall of Saigon in the 1975 saw an influx of Vietnamese refugees to America. In the middle 1970s, the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida served as an American resettlement center, and eventually thousands of Vietnamese was relocated to the Sunshine State. By the 1970s, many of them have settled in Orlando, Tampa, and Pittsburgh area. 1980 census indicated over 7,000 Vietnamese reside in Florida, and decades later, the number increased to more than 16,000. Since 1975, in sharp contrast with previous immigration history, Indians have become the fast-growing Asian group in Florida, and Asian Indians has continually outpaced every other ethnic group socioeconomically. Well, a large number of them were highly regarded professionals such as engineers, scientists, professors, computer programs, and other skilled technicians. A substantial number of Asian Indians are also small business operators, running motels, gas stations, and dollar stores. By 1994, almost 400 Florida motels are run by Asian Indians. And here's some census data over the last 60, 70 years. So you can see the drastic increase of Asian Americans in Sunshine State. This is a single category, people self-reporting. So Asian Indians, the largest, followed by Filipinos, Chinese, and Vietnamese. So those are the few largest group. Again, tremendous increase. This is the same data, just show on the graphic chart. And if you combine with others combined categories according to census group, so the number is almost 900,000. If you factor in, so this is the top 10 of the ethnic group in the Sunshine State. There's reason to believe there's probably a substantial number of undocumented immigrants from Asia. So my guess is that the number will over 1 million that currently. That's the 2023 American Community Census Survey. So the official data indicate that Asians currently count about 4.17% of total Florida population of 21.5 million. So it's slightly below the national average, but definitely the fastest growing population census group in the Sunshine State. So Asian Americans have been playing an increasingly visible and important role in the state economic, social, and political affairs. Asian Indians, Filipinos, Chinese, and Vietnamese are among the largest ethnic Asian groups currently living in Florida today. Many of them congregate in the major metropolitan areas seeking employment opportunities. Kinship, cultural connections will make a significant contribution to the growth of Sunshine State economy. Thank you.
So for our next segment, we're going to have some moderated discussions of some of the topics that are of interest to Asian Americans and also hopefully the group who are present today here. So Ian, the first question I actually have for you is something that people oftentimes talk about, which is also the backdrop of today's program. You know, especially in the last few years, I have often heard my friends or people that I know saying that, why are we still talking about identity politics? Like today, why are we singling out the Asian American experience and talking about their successes and issues, instead of simply talking about that we're in the United States, it's supposed to be a colorblind society. Everything should be meritocracy, right? So that seems to be such a divide between people where we are hitting a wall that we cannot really transport the experiences from one group to another, because certain people are really upholding this view that we should totally ignore race, ethnicity, instead focus only on this ideal colorblind society. So my first question to you is, in this backdrop of the political environment we are in, why is it still so important for us to have a program like today, to have a dialogue about a particular group's experience and examining their successes and challenges to bridge this understanding? Why is that important?
That's a great question, and it's an important question because I think that is a major talking point. I heard the chuckles when Jin said that the United States is supposed to be a colorblind society. So I think some of you maybe already have an inkling of why that feels a little off, given the remarks that I and Professor Zhang gave. I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me is that even if you just read the news, it's very clear that race and ethnicity continues to be a major obsession for American society. And it's not just because people of color, Asians, Latinos, African Americans continue bringing it up. It is something that nobody was, asking for. So let me give you an example, and this is maybe a place where your expertise may be especially helpful. Some of you may know about the law here in Florida, but also in roughly 20 other states that was passed that says that people from foreign countries of concern, including China, are not allowed to buy land, especially agricultural property, near places near critical infrastructure in the United States. It's been named as a national security issue. The reason why this is kind of red herring is because if you look at the statistics, foreigners own roughly 3% of agricultural property in the United States, 1% by Chinese people. So what is the rash of apparently foreign, ownership of agricultural property that is prompting this, sort of national security concern, right? No one is causing this issue. No one is bringing up a sort of race and citizenship in this way, except for certain leaders who seek it as a way to get votes and get the political spotlight. And we can talk a little bit more in detail about the current status of that particular bill, but I say this as in part to sort of say that this is an experience that Asian Americans continue to have. The identity and how people think about who they are partly is internal. It's your own sort of pride and the traditions and cultural patterns that your parents and grandparents passed down to you. But that's not all it is. It is also the way that other people perceive you out in the streets and out in society. And so there's a degree of control that Asian Americans have and other minorities have in how they move throughout the world and how they think about who they are. But there's also a lot that's outside of their control. A lot of ways in which people project anxieties and concerns and worries onto Asian Americans and other racial minorities in this country. And that's something that's a conversation that we have to continue to have, because in some ways this is a conversation that has been at the heart of American history from the founding of this country.
Thank you. That's a very insightful answer. You mentioned that particular law in the state of Florida. So in regards to that question, my comment would be that while we continue to talk about that America is the meritocracy society, but at the same time though, using that law as an example, if you don't have the representation and you don't have the voice at the table, like you said, a lot of the decisions are made when you are not there, then your interest is not looked at. Therefore, in a way, representation is still vitally important, because that's how we can make sure the stories from particular perspectives are told. And once the stories are told, there are people who are open-minded, will be able to listen in and take that in. Versus if there is no representation, then one aspect of the story and the history will become a black hole to people. So while I really have, a lot of people around me who continue to say we're colorblind, but in this moment in history, representation from all walks of life is perhaps even more important than before. So
let me add really quickly onto that. I think one of the things that to me is a core principle of the work that I do and who I am as a person is that differences make us stronger. I mean, that sounds trite and perhaps, it's sort of an overdone line. But if you look at, for example, research from business schools, they find that when there are more diverse perspectives at the table, people make better decisions because you don't engage in groupthink. And you have folks who come at it from a different angle and sort of say, are you sure this is the right thing? Are you sure this is the right way to talk to certain communities? And so you have a diverse set of folks at the table. You are actually making better decisions. It is, in fact, in the interest of this country, of business, of education, of everyone, to have a diverse set of folks represented so that you understand and have the wealth of ideas and exchanges that allow you to make better decisions. So there is, I think, one of the things that we might sort of try to think about is how to convince those who don't share this belief that, in fact, you make better decisions, that we are all better off together if we are thinking about what everyone brings to the table. It's not so much identity politics as a collective interest in making sure that we have the best ideas at the table.
yes, that's very important. So my next question for Yan is one of the topics you mentioned in your remarks, in which you touched on the fact that in the last year or so, one of the most significant things that has happened in our higher education, and which also is perceived as one of the most critical issues for the Asian American community, is the overruling of the affirmative action. So a lot of the talks I have heard from certain Asian American friends are that this is a victory. But other people say that this is actually a step back in history because of the ramifications, because of the bigger picture of shutting down diversity efforts, inclusion efforts. So this issue really has become one of the focal points that perhaps has divided within the Asian American community. And it also has historically become one of the motivation factors for people to have voted a certain way when they have perhaps aligned otherwise on certain other issues. So, Yan, I really am interested, especially you being a professor, to talk about really what are the ramifications of the overturn of affirmative action? How in the big picture that fits into one of the critical points you made is that the Asian Americans needs to band with other minority groups and other groups in order to have outreach, in order to have bigger impact. How all of that work together in the context of the affirmative action?
Yeah, it's one of the hardest issues right now in the community. I talked a little bit before about the ethnic breakdown of support for affirmative action. And it's lowest, in fact, among Chinese immigrants, recent Chinese immigrants. And part of what I think should be an important starting point is, again, to acknowledge that there is a lot of investment in these decisions. People care immensely about them because it affects the futures of their children. But I also think it's important to recognize that we really are too invested in a system that too narrowly defines what success looks like. And so, if you remember sort of the slide that I put up earlier, one of the quotes from the opinion of the decision is that even the conservative justices who voted to overturn affirmative action say this opinion should not be taken as saying that you cannot discuss the significance of your racial background in your college applications. Colleges and universities can't proactively sort of solicit it and consider it. But even the conservative justices recognize that this is something that is intrinsically important to a lot of people and that brings a lot of value and perspective in how they think about who they are and what they're going to be, how they're going to be a college student. And so there is still a possibility to talk about your racial background. You just have to sort of think a little bit more deeply about what it means, why is this important to you, and how do you want to bring that to the college and university that you're applying to. And that's always been what professors and admissions officers have asked college students actually to do. That even though there was this charge that there were admissions decisions that were turning on whether or not somebody was Asian or not, that since the early 2000s, as some of you who know the case law know, the Supreme Court has not actually allowed colleges and universities to have a point system as to race and ethnicity, that they could consider as part of a holistic admissions process. And that's what all colleges and universities have been practicing up until June. So I think that's one of the things that I want to sort of, I think it's really hard to get away from the intense emotional dynamics of this decision. But one of the things that I want to sort of encourage folks to think about is to use it as an invitation to again reflect on who they are, where they come from, and why that is meaningful, and what they might share with the communities that they're a part of, whether it's at work, whether it's in college admissions, whether it's in your religious groups, that is a conversation that is important and meaningful to have.
Okay, very good. So my next question is that, even in the slides that you have shown us, we see now Asian Americans everywhere nowadays, in movies, television shows, and social media. Is that enough? If it's not, why isn't enough?
I think, as I said earlier, one of the things that is important to look for is the message behind the face you see, right? That it's not enough to just sort of look for, diverse faces, but to sort of see what is the story really about. And so one of the things that has changed, and that I think has changed for the better, is that the production side of Hollywood has gotten also more diverse. That's partly why we see more diversity, is because you have people like Mindy Kaling, for example. Those of you who have watched the Mindy Project will recognize that name. She's now creating shows like Never Have I Ever, right? And so opening up the financial side, the production side of Hollywood also means that you have more diverse representation on screen. But diversity only gets us so far if you just sort of look for faces. Part of that is also asking about how these particular movies or TV shows, music, or social media, how that is advancing the conversation in a meaningful way towards making change, rather than just reinforcing old stereotypes. We know many of them from Asian American history, of Asians as foreigners, Asians as the sort of dweeby kid, Asians as the model minority. How are these movies and TV shows really changing that narrative? And I would encourage all of you who maybe like Netflix and Hulu to seek out these shows that really tell a slightly different story, a newer story that you haven't heard before. And those are the shows and those are the TV, those are the films to really support as you engage with the Asian American experience.
All right, so looking behind the surface and really dive deeper. My next question is that, why is it important for the Asian American community to partner with other minority communities, and how can we build those alliances more effectively?
Yeah, this is something that I talked about before as things that are that we have historical examples of. I give you the example of Larry Itliong, the Filipino-American farm worker leader who worked with Cesar Chavez. There is also the example of a woman named Yuriko Chiyama, who's a Japanese-American woman who was one of Malcolm X's biggest supporters, was actually, if you remember, I don't know, some of you maybe remember the Life magazine spread of Malcolm X's assassination. The woman who is cradling his head at the moment of his death is actually a Japanese-American woman named Yuriko Chiyama who believed deeply in the Black freedom struggle. And we have these moments from the past to guide us of ways in which Asian Americans have reached across different racial boundaries to sort of say, this matters to me too, right? The most recent example of this is in the discussions around the building of the wall and the migrant detention policies. One of the groups that fought most strongly and vocally against those policies were Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated themselves during World War II. They went to the border and they stood 80-year-old, 90-year-old women who had been in camps as children, stood there and said, we will not watch this happen again on our watch because we remember what this did to us and we remember what it did to our family. And I think part of what I hope folks will take away from this conversation again is that the thing that hopefully can drive these collaborations and partnerships is a sense of empathy, of remembering that, however hard and difficult it was for you, that same sense of struggle is valid in somebody else's experience, and based on that shared experience, to work together towards a more just future.
That's great. So one of the things that we talk about are the obstacles in the last many years, and especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. But you also mentioned in your prepared remarks that even in those moments of trials, Asian Americans and Americans as a whole always have found a way and forged a way forward. So what will be your words of encouragement in this particular time that we are in? If people are feeling very discouraged, or people are feeling isolated, or feeling not heard, not represented, do not have voice, what will be your words of hopefulness and also encouragement for them?
I think history actually provides a lot of hope and encouragement because it provides a sense of what has been possible in the past. So that's one of the things that keeps me actually quite excited about teaching this history, even though many moments of it are very dark. I would encourage folks to find joy, encouragement in being with one another, in supporting one another, and coming to events like this, but also coming to events where maybe you feel a little out of place because you're not used to that particular environment or you don't know the conversation as well. And that's why I'm so grateful that so many of you have come to the James tonight, even with what's going on outside weather-wise, to learn a little bit more and to maybe sit a little bit with the discomfort of, oh gosh, this feels terrible. It's terrible that these things happen. But that's okay, you weren't the one who did it. But to learn about that and to realize that there are people out there who have these experiences and to learn about ways that you can support them. For Asian Americans and for my friends, who I talk to, who struggle with the kind of heavy weight of what's happening in the world right now, to seek help and to find ways, things that spark joy, whether it's a TV show that you watch or a book or music or poetry. I think creative forms of expression oftentimes make our lives kind of more beautiful and lighter. And there are one of the sort of great things about the explosion of Asian American media is that there is so much, and I'm happy to drop a couple of suggestions, so many wonderful Asian American novels that have come out. Some of you may have read Pachinko, which got turned into a major TV show by the Korean American author Jin Liu. Seek out refuge in some of these beautiful expressions and remind yourself what it means to be uplifted by who you are as a person and the communities that you belong to. And then based on that, reach out to others to see how they might need help as well.
I think that's a very wonderful message. My other, maybe the last question that I will ask you, then I will open up for audience question, is that just like you, I'm so heartwarmed by the fact that so many of you came out today during this very bad weather in particular, but also have shown a great deal of interest in topics like this, to bridge the gaps of our understanding, to broaden our views, to open our hearts and minds, which is so wonderful. And that's what I also try to strive to do and have my kids do. But then one of the biggest challenges I fear that our time has presented to us is that oftentimes we feel like we're preaching to the choir, we're talking to an echo chamber, we are talking to the same familiar faces who care, who want to hear those issues, but we haven't been successful in finding a way to really bridge the gap between people who already brought in the idea of diversity, brought the idea of being able to listen, being able to relate to other people's experiences, care about a broader society versus a more narrower group of people, and also be able to respectfully convey messages that will enlist people's willingness to listen. So, Professor, you teach a lot of students how do you see that we can find a way to make each other listen, to be able to respectfully convey those ideas and share different views, and then that not only we hope other people can listen to us, but we are also willing to listen to other people's points of view. How do we do that?
If I knew how to answer that question, I think I would be a lot, wealthier. There's no magic bullet. I think there are a couple things that come to mind. The first is, I think especially in this political moment, we've all gotten very used to being comfortable with our points of view and our perspectives. And less we have uncomfortable or difficult conversations with people. And one of the things that perhaps you might do tonight is, we are recording this event in part because we thought maybe there wouldn't be so many folks out in the rain, but you all came and that's amazing. But to share that or to forward that link or that video to somebody who you think, oh, maybe you might be interested in this. I'm a big believer in meeting people where they are, right? To sort of think about the sort of interests that you might share with somebody who maybe doesn't have the same views with you on diversity, to sort of say, hey, remember that great Chinese restaurant we went to last fall? You want to know a little bit more about the history of the community that served you that food, or that whose food traditions we enjoyed so much together, right? To sort of think about ways that others may have at least an inkling or curiosity about some of the things that we talked about here tonight, and to use that as an opening in the door to reach out to folks who might not otherwise be willing and ready to sort of have a conversation about Japanese American incarceration during World War II or affirmative action. We can get to those things, but we can really meet people where they are and start small and go from there.
Great advice. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions from the audience.
Thank you for your remarks. I really enjoyed the overview that you gave, and especially bringing it to the present day. I wanted to ask a question about the role of religion. I know that's actually quite broad and diverse across Asia, and I can imagine there have been moments in sort of popular American culture where perhaps Buddhism has been an asset, but if you think about maybe South Asia and the role of Islam, it's maybe been the opposite. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how that has affected the Asian American experience.
Thank you for that wonderful question. That is one of the axes of diversity that you really see in the Asian American community. We talked a little bit about kind of where people are from, what languages they speak, but religious background is heavily tied to that. I'll give you one example in which religion has been a really kind of key moment in Asian American history, and that was after 9/11. Some of you may remember that after 9/11, there was a rash of Islamophobia because of the attacks on the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that happened was that Indian Americans were targeted. Many of them come from a community called the Sikh community. They wear turbans as part of their religious practice. And folks who didn't understand that tradition and didn't recognize who they were, right, targeted them because they thought that they were Muslims who were enemies of America, for example. And so in that way, we also see the way that religion has affected Asian Americans in terms of the perception and the sort of confusion around Asian American religions. But it's also been a tremendous pillar of strength that there have been, perhaps here in the Tampa Bay area, temples and gurdwaras and mosques and Buddhist centers where you can go and people can find peace. So that is one of I have friends and colleagues who are working on studying this phenomenon more deeply, but it is one of the very important aspects of the Asian American community, and I really appreciate you bringing it up.
Thank you for great presentations. I wish I could be here for the other 17 that I missed. Relationships between cultures, between nations, are developed, I believe, on two levels. One is a personal relationship, people I meet, I deal with, and it's also affected by what happens between two nations at a high level, the national level. And what my question relates to the challenges that we presently have between two countries, America and China. There are economic challenges, technological challenges, military, social, cultural. And I'm wondering if you might have an opinion for the future, what might happen at the national level, and feel free to be optimistic or pessimistic.
One of the things I try to stay away from as a historian is prognosticating about the future. So I may disappoint you in that regard. But what I will say is this. I think one of the things that we understand is that relations don't get better when people stop talking to each other, right? Some of you may have family experience with that. It just ices things out, right? And so one of the things that was, I think, most dangerous and worrisome for me as a professor and as an academic was seeing the elimination of something like a Fulbright program, right? Which has historically sent people back and forth to different countries to study and learn. One of the strengths of the United States has been its higher education system that says, come to our country, train in our universities, whether you stay or whether you go, you had some experience with American life, but also with American training and colleges and universities, right? One of the things that's happening in Florida right now is, as some of you may know, there is another law, aside from the land law, that says that labs in state universities and colleges cannot hire graduate students and postdocs from, again, foreign countries of concern to do research in Florida, right? And that's bad policy on a number of levels, in my opinion. One, it doesn't bring you the best minds of who can do that research, but it also eliminates the opportunities for people to come to this country and sort of experience what American values and American life looks like, and to create those opportunities for conversation. So I think, my answer to you is maybe very sort of small, but I think an important part, which is to keep, I hope that at a national level, programs and connections that keep a dialogue open between China and the United States, whatever else happens militarily and economically, that those can continue to be part of the picture.
Oh, hi. Firstly, I want to say I'm really glad I made it tonight. Thank you, and Dr. Zhang, for the beautiful talk. I'm a first-generation immigrant from China. Today I think I learned more than the last 35 years I've been in this country. Yeah. The things that, what you said and Dr. Zhang said, similarly, echoes with me as a first-generation immigration. But I don't want to, go into my stuff. But I want to ask a question today is, what's going on? Every level, everything engaged. I want to know what's, the new technology like AI would bring something to the table to move forward.
I have never gotten that question. But here's what I'll say. I think one of the challenges with the way that different communities interact with one another and different countries interact with one another right now has to do with a lot of misinformation, right? And one of the things that I find troubling as a professor, as an educator with AI, is that people are developing less than they used to, a real ability to critically examine the sources of information that they come across, right? And sort of put something into ChatGPT and say, help me figure this out, or how do I deal with this? And not sort of question, where did that information come from? Is it reliable? And so that creates opportunities for mistrust and for bias, because you're not really thinking about, you're sort of taking somebody's word for it. And you should treat my presentation and Dr. Zhang's presentation in the same way, right? And if you were to email me, which I welcome you to do, ianshin@umich.edu, I would send you the reports and research that our discussions are based off of, and I'm sure that Professor Zhang would do the same. But one of the things I hope for is that, one of the things I fear, but also one of the things that I hope for, is that we can continue to train the next generation of folks and folks who are becoming more frequent users of AI to not just take that at its word, but to actually sort of think about, what am I learning here? Is that true? And that's one of the things that I worry most about my students at the University of Michigan too.
I want to be selfish, but I'm going to try not to be. Because in the very beginning when you were introduced, you mentioned that you have a book coming out, Politics of Art. That intrigued me. But as you talked, and I thought about all your questions about what we can do, how we can be active, it comes back in my mind to you. You have done such an incredible job for me tonight. And I'm thinking, do you have an agent? Do we need to get you on Ken Burns and have him do a program, which he just did on the Bison, but on immigration and the Chinese American? Because we can connect links to our friends and people that we know, and I will do that. But we need a big audience, especially in 2024 with our upcoming presidential election. You are a phenomenal speaker. You are bright. You are engaging. So, do you have an agent?
The work that I presented and shared with all of you tonight stands on the shoulders of generations of people who've come before me. I am the beneficiary of a system that has been growing to learn about this history since the 1960s. The research that I draw upon and that I do is relatively new, because it wasn't really until the 1960s that people started to be interested in the experiences of women, in the experiences of Black people, of Latinos, of Asians, of indigenous people. And so it was only within the last 2 or 3 generations where we have had folks who enable me to do and present the kind of work that I'm able to do tonight. And so I'm enormously grateful to them because I couldn't do it without them. And I think very much, to be honest, about who is at the table and who's not. And that's one of the things that I would invite all of you to think about. When I am given an opportunity to do something like this, I think about, am I the best person to do it? Not because I know it or I don't know it, but because there might be people who could bring a slightly different message, a different face that people haven't seen before, right? There are, just to be kind of meta for a second, there are a lot of folks who associate Asian American history with people who look like me, who are East Asian, who are Chinese, right? But would it benefit the museum maybe to hear from somebody who is Vietnamese American, or Laotian, or Cambodian, right? Or somebody who is from Guam, or from Hawaii? These are some of the other conversations we can continue to pursue, and I'm happy to take the ball down the field. Michigan just won, so football's kind of top of mind. To take the ball down the field as far as I can go, but I also am very cognizant that I want to make sure that I create space at the table for others who may have other perspectives to add to the conversation. And so I hope that that can also be something you think about when you go back to the office tomorrow, or when you go back home, or you, again, go to church, is to think about, who do I see here, who am I hearing from, and who am I not hearing from, and what are some of those conversations we need to have. But I appreciate it. That's a very lovely thought and a very lovely question.
I want to say one last thing. Humility, you have it. And that's what would make you a great mouthpiece as we go forward in this tumultuous 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shin and Dr. Zhang, for your wonderful presentations and also the answers. I learned a lot. I feel a little bit of optimism and also the downside as well. Some people are talking about all the time. And before the whole thing began, we had a conversation out there, and my friend Richard was saying, "Oh, you always have a optimistic face," and sometimes optimistic face appears out of almost hopeless situations. And I hope that we can keep optimism still going, even if there is a lot of despair and problems. One thing I'm thinking, how just to piggyback on what you were talking about, is how do we carry on some of the opportunities? For example, there are certain things we have no control over, but for example, I'm always grateful to the James Museum for hosting this special exhibition on early Chinese American history, which tells me a lot. I learned a lot, even though I did the translation and I worked with the curator with a little assistance, but I still, every time I go through, I learn something more. And if we can bring our friends, our colleagues to come and see, and also tell some of the stories we have learned, I think that's part of this whole dialogue and communication that will improve the mutual understanding and the relationship. And I also like, St. Pete is such an open city that from the end of this month until sometime next month, they're going to host a show called The Chinese Lady, which tells the story very similar to what James Museum is doing, but not at this scale. That Chinese lady was brought in the 1940s, and the whole thing is such a story that will really bring a lot of understanding between Chinese and with any, not just Chinese Americans, but any ethnic group. So I hope that all of us will go to that show also, but I have no connection with that show, so I'm not doing advertisement. But particularly for the James Museum, I really appreciate, so we can all do something. And that's why I'm volunteering here, and also this Saturday, actually, we're going to bring the largest group of Chinese school students from Tampa. 40-some people are coming to see the show. So.
That's great. I'll just say really quickly, I hope the show goes on tour. I don't know if there are any plans for it. It really would have a wonderful life, especially there are lots of museums of sort of Western art, and I'm thinking of the Amon Carter in Texas. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. This show should go on the road, and lots of people should see it. I'll tell you what my favorite part of the show is. I love the section on Z.S. Liang. I had no idea that there was an Asian American artist who has spent the last 20 years of his life painting Native American history, Native American narratives. That just blows my mind. Because, again, that's not a conversation that we have generally seen happen. And when I think about learning about something like that, I don't feel bad that I was ignorant of it. I am overjoyed by the inspiration I derive from understanding there's a new perspective and a new set of connections that someone has made. So I spent so much time upstairs a lot yesterday afternoon, but most of it was in the Z.S. Liang section. So I hope some of you have a chance to take a look at it. The Chinese Lady is a wonderful show. I had a chance to see it earlier last year, and I hope some of you check it out. But the thing I also want to sort of say really quickly, and this in fact goes back to the last question, is I don't know that I am any more qualified than any of my colleagues to do this work. What I do try to do really hard, when I hope that we did here tonight, what I hope that you can do if you go see The Chinese Lady, is to just listen. I try very hard to listen. And it's amazing what a difference that makes. I try to do that in the classroom. I try to do that when I'm having conversations, in the lobby with Bruce and Linda, right, in the auditorium at the museum before this talk started. Before we start inventing what our response is going to be, to imagine kind of the prepackaged soundbite that's going to come out of our mouth, to really just take a genuine interest in what somebody else has to say for a change, and to react to that. Right? And that's what I hope I've been able to give to you tonight. That's something that this show is able to inspire, is a sense of listening to one another, and really trying to learn rather than just coming at it with preconceived notions.
First of all, you need an agent. And I know you say you're not more qualified than others, but here's the thing, you're saying it. You're saying it, you're putting this information out, and I'm gonna tell you, just from my own experience, because I'm where you are, not a lot of us are saying it. Not a lot of Asian Americans have found their voice. It's not in our culture. We're taught to stay low. We're taught to stay humble. We're taught to do what people say. And this is what I speak about and I write about. You mentioned the bamboo ceiling. I did publish an article in the Journal of Intercultural Communication on Filipino Americans and the bamboo ceiling. And the biggest thing about us is that a lot of times we don't break out. I love how you brought up those of us who have pushed back, but it's not in our culture. And my research was specifically on how Filipino American values, which are very similar to many Asian values, cultural values, they conflict with our assertiveness. And with 500 Filipino American participants, we found that we're not assertive because of our culture. And then it's so crazy because afterwards, I was like, here are my results, everyone. Thank you for participating. And they said, but what do we do? And what I did, I didn't know. I just finished my PhD, I'm done. But I did what you're doing. I started looking into it, looking more deeply, giving hope in the Jokois and the Crazy Rich Asians, showing people these are our challenges, letting them realize what their cultural values are, and helping them bridge the gap. We need to have these conversations. You need to get an agent. You need to get out there. I want to watch you on, I think that a lot of us who talk about this also lose a lot of opportunities. Like you were saying, the influencers on TikTok, people are watching that and they're getting inspired and they're getting empowered. And so that's what I do. I'm on TikTok and YouTube and all that. I did 3 TEDx talks. I'm trying to get out there. But I need you to do that too. I want to know though, because you didn't bring it up a lot, and I'm sure you think about it, what you think about the cultural values and how that creates the disconnect. And in all of that you brought up, our victories as well as our challenges.
Yeah, and I want to, when I think about sort of Asian cultural values, it's almost hard to generalize because it is, again, such a large agglomeration of different backgrounds and countries and peoples and societies. I have the same instinct. I remember I tell my students when I was, before I went to get my PhD, I worked in management consulting in the business world. And I was one of these, little peons who ran numbers and Excel sheets and stayed up late. And my first year, I got a great review and they gave me a big bonus and he said, "You're great, you're a rock star." Felt great. As I ascended into sort of the middle manager position, where I had to start managing clients and having conversations with them and really putting myself out there and making myself uncomfortable and approaching people and asking for things, I found that my career started to stagnate because I was so uncomfortable doing it. And I didn't really have the kind of training and support. So I think that's when you look at the sort of the research behind some of these, and you're an expert on this, but for those of you who are interested in this issue specifically, I recommend a book called Stuck by a sociologist named Margaret Shin. And she talks about the necessity of certain programs that are possible, again, because of something like affirmative action and DE&I, that help to support the development of Asian American professionals who are often seen as being untrustworthy or unfriendly or robotic, that those are often sort of the words that are used to describe Asian American professionals. And there are programs that can be developed in different workplaces to address that. So it is such a deeply ingrained part of who we are, but it's also true that there are other possibilities that we can fight out of that stereotype.
Just your voice. You just going out there, you're empowering to all of us. We need to keep hearing you. Thank you so much.
So
So Julie, so it says 7:55. Should we have two more questions?
Two more?
Yeah.
Let's take them together, and then I'll try to answer them both. And I'm happy to stick around for a little while longer to chat with you all. So if you don't get your question answered, please feel free to come up afterwards.
This is a short one because it doesn't involve a question, but it does involve a thank you to Professor Zhang, Professor Shin. Wonderful, really inspiring. But Mr. and Mrs. Boxer, for the quality support that you've shown us over the last 6 or 7 weeks, it's extraordinary. And the collaboration from the James Museum is exactly what this community needs to be a cultural and social hub for everyone. We've seen great film, we have wonderful art and supporting information and translations from my friend Mr. Shi. But really, it's the vision and guidance of Julie Mattis leaning against this wall, who is leaving us at the end of this month. It breaks our heart, and I hope your legacy continues. Thank you again, professors.
Thank you.
Get one question back here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tonight. It's such an important conversation. My family took in Vietnamese refugees when I was 4, and they lived in our house until I was about 7. And I think the thing that is really important to me is because I was so young, that conversation was never had with me about why they were there. So my question, 50 years later, is how today do I become an ally? I don't go to church, I'm not in the education system, I don't work, very white, but only on the outside. Only on the outside. And yes, voting, very important, right? Our community leaders, whatnot, but there must be resources that I don't know about that I would like to share with my community. You know, is it enough to start a dinner party that goes to Asian restaurants every other week, or stores, or cultural outings? I mean, we all love the Saigon night market, right? So, but there has to be more for me to do. And where do I find that?
That's a great question for us to end on. What can all of us do, honestly? I wanted to sort of observe really quickly and acknowledge, what you shared in terms of the conversation that you never got to have, between the ages of 4 and 7 about why there were these people living in your house. I think one of the things that we are seeing right now in this country and this state and elsewhere in the United States is a desire to tell only a very specific version of the American story, the story of the American past. I've dedicated my life and my career now, hopefully for the next couple decades, to telling a more complicated story, a story that sometimes makes us uncomfortable, to realizing that, oh yes, we were fighting some wars, and we've been fighting wars in different parts of the world for a very long time, and that has led different people to come to the United States, not just Asians and Vietnamese, but also Latinos. And so one of the things that I hope we can all push for, and this goes in some ways to your question about what to do, is for kind of implementation and execution and carry through. It's great that we've got this sort of first step of Asian American history in K-12 education here in the state of Florida. You're really actually in the vanguard of doing that, and it's really impressive. But it really depends on where it goes from here, right? And are we going to tell that story absent of the contributions and alliances with Black people and Latinos, or are we going to tell a version that's actually, troubling and difficult but important to actually unpack together, right? So that's one thing to sort of think about. I go back to my advice earlier on sort of a big tent approach to thinking about bringing people into these conversations. And this is the one, Jin's question earlier about how do we talk to people who aren't already listening or who aren't already sort of open to the ideas that we are talking about here tonight. How do you reach them, right? Saigon Night Market sounds great. I would love to go with you. I don't know when it happens, but we can go afterwards if the rain has stopped. Sort of meeting people where they are and having a book club or a movie night, those are sort of the open, it's just because we're all so curious about sort of cultures that may be different from us, to use that as an opening to have kind of deeper, harder conversations about what race relations in this country look like, what the history of imperialism in the United States looks like, by the United States looks like. But you also don't have to do all of that work by yourself. And I'm so glad, again, I want to echo the comment that thanked James, bringing somebody to this exhibit as, again, a way to start thinking about some of these issues, some of these connections that people haven't made before, I think would be a really wonderful way to start. But I don't think there's a magic pill. I don't think there's a magical solution to solving these problems. And so I appreciate so much folks who come tonight who aren't from the community and are interested in learning. And I hope that we've given you some things to think about in terms of taking a first step in sharing some of this history with others in your life.
So now I have the privilege to close out tonight. I think many of you have already said that we wanted to thank the James Museum for hosting us, for Mr. and Mrs. Boxer for such a wonderful diversity initiative, for your consistent many years of efforts to put those programs together. And we wanted to thank our distinguished speakers. I know that we're all fighting to become Ian's agent now, right? I'm hoping to see him more. But also, I wanted to highlight and also really thank all the audience for coming out tonight. When I came to the United States to go to law school in the year of 2002, I went to Kansas City. And just like so many first-generation immigrants, when we first came here, we thought we were just studying here. But then it's really the system, but more so the people of America who have attracted us, converted us to become the believer of this society. And you all have shown to us that genuineness of willingness to listen, to open your minds, to become the evangelist of messages like tonight, and also to become vanguard of change. So I know that together we're going to do great things. And so thank you all for your participation and for your caring, because it's with those that we can move forward. Thank you all.